Hello, we're going to go into a brief introduction of something called non-market benefits. So for a host of things that we value, certainly is the case in the natural world, there are things out there that we like, we enjoy, that aren't bought and sold in a marketplace, in a traditional market setting. And we want to know how much those are valued. We want to have some measure and be able to discuss some idea of benefits and value so that we can evaluate policies that might require real resources or things that are traded in the market um, uh, to provide for them. So let's get started. So the traditional view of economics is built around this idea of prices as a signal of value, that I can go into the grocery store and I see some interactions of supply and demand that produce a price. So the question is, what happens if we have things like wildlife or recreation days, scenic values, climate regulation that are not traded in a traditional market? We still want to talk about the value of those goods, so we can talk about the trade-off, so we can talk about whether or not investments in some sort of public good in sort of a park or clean air are worth it. So this is what we're going to be doing today. First, we're going to go through a handful of definitions in categories. So ecosystem goods and services is a phrase that has come around. It's become more popular anyway within the last couple of decades. Of ways to categorize and think about ecosystem non-market benefits, so things in nature. There's four categories listed here: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. Provisioning ecosystems, goods and services, sometimes I'll just lump those together under ecosystem services. Or often I like to think of things that we can touch, things that we consume or directly experience, things that are sort of exist in the physical world. Food, for example, comes from nature, either whether it's agriculture grown by nature plus human inputs, or food that grows in the wild. Yeah, fish, berries, right? Whatever. These are things that we can touch and we can consume. This is a provisioning ecosystem service. Similarly, raw materials, things like wood for timber production, coal out of the ground. These are raw materials that you can touch. Drinking water you can consume. These are provisioning services. So I largely think of provisioning services are things that you can touch. Regulating ecosystem services are the things that nature does that largely makes life sustainable on this planet. The role of trees and vegetation and carbon sequestration, the role of healthy watersheds and wetlands and flood protection, healthy climates in general for disease control, wildlife population, and their role in essentially spreading disease or keeping disease under control. These are regulating ecosystem services. They're the things that nature does that we value that makes life possible. Cultural ecosystem services are generally experiences, so personal experiences that you might have in nature. So if you go out into the mountains to recreate for skiing or biking or hiking, fishing, these are things that all have value to us, but that we can't touch, that don't regulate the Earth's atmosphere, and also that aren't bought and sold in traditional market. Now, these are cultural ecosystem services. They include things like recreation, things like spiritual connection or values related to solitude, and science. All of these are cultural ecosystem services, ways that we experience nature and ways that nature gives us value. There's this fourth category, supporting ecosystem services, that are sometimes included and sometimes not. Supporting ecosystem services are ecosystem services that make the other ecosystem services possible. The most popular one is pollination, maybe biodiversity as well. Pollinator services, we value bees, partly because we value bees in general, that we enjoy seeing them. That's different than the role that bees, or the job that bees perform. We value pollination because it makes things like food possible. makes things like the flowers that we go out and experience through recreation or some sort of spiritual connection or enjoyment in general possible. Pollination makes other ecosystem services possible. It's not the final product in itself, it's a step towards the final product. So we call this supporting ecosystem services. Biodiversity would fall under this, nutrient cycling and habitat provision. It's true that habitat is a solid sort of thing, but we don't value often habitat for habitat's sake. Often we value habitat because it provides for wildlife that we enjoy in other ways, either through recreation, spiritual connection, or consuming. Other useful phrases are two sides of a coin for valuation and the way we discuss it. First is called willingness to pay. Willingness to pay is the maximum the consumer would pay over and above the current cost of using the resource. Sometimes it's called equivalent variation because it's how much, if I paid that amount to get a good, it's that balance, that equivalent balance. I'm just as happy either with or without the good after I've paid for it. And so it's generally to get something. So if I walk into the store and I see a shirt on the rack and say, regardless of what the price is, I'm willing to pay $50 for that shirt. It's the maximum that I pay. This is my willingness to pay for the shirt. The other side of the coin is something called willingness to accept. So willingness to accept is the minimum payment accepted by a consumer that is willing to go without a given resource. Often it's called compensated variation, because it's how much you can pay me, you can compensate me to be just as happy with something that's bad, right? So if there's a loud noise outside, lots of street noise or poor air quality, something that I don't want to be around, there's this idea that, I don't really like this noise, but if you paid me $300, I'd be willing to endure it. Willingness to accept is that minimum payment that I'd be willing to accept to endure something like a bad noise or poor air quality. Now, it's not necessarily the case that willingness to pay equals willingness to accept. It is true that you can generally rephrase a good as a bad or a bad as a good. We can talk about that movement from clean air. So if I'm talking about moving from clean air to enduring bad air, this is a willingness to accept concept. How much would you have to pay me to endure loss in air quality? If I'm starting with poor air quality and I would say, how much would I be willing to pay to get to clean air? This is willingness to pay. In a minute, we're going to talk a little bit when those two are the same and when they're not. But first, let's go through a few examples. Willingness to pay is often for things that you get. So willingness to pay for pizza, willingness to pay for a beautiful day on the lake. So you're going to consume something, you're going to enjoy something. It's your willingness to pay. Willingness to accept is things that I don't like. Willingness to accept an hour's worth of work. And while I like my job, I'd rather maybe be fishing instead of spending hours in the office. How much would I be willing to accept to make those hours in the office worth it? If you're thinking about things like oil wells on properties or in watersheds, how much would I be willing to accept so that I'm just as happy with an oil well on my property, but with the payment, or without an oil well on my property, but without the payment, and willingness to accept noise on your street. These are all sort of how much would you be willing to accept to endure something that you'd rather not have, maybe. So when does willingness to pay equal willingness to accept? You can think of something like rephrasing the question or rephrasing the way we talk about consuming a good. Here's an example of airplane space. So willingness to pay for more legroom on a plane. Often when you check in, they ask you if you want to pick premium seats. That's a willingness to pay question. Are you willing to pay the $20 for the extra legroom? First, willingness to accept smaller space on a plane. If you're in a larger seat, how much would you be willing to give up $20 to move to a less quality or less spacious seat? And if those two are the same, so it seems like the same question, often it is. It really depends on often something called the income effect. So once you have the money, so once you are your choices likely to be different? If your income affects the decision, then there's no reason to believe that willingness to pay will equal willingness to accept, because one involves pain, so losing income, and the other one involves receiving payment or increasing your income. There's lots of other things out there that are mentioned in text available on the internet that are biases in the way we'll perform. So there's something called the status quo bias, something called the endowment effect, and something called loss aversion. So we'll talk about these briefly in the next slides, but they're interesting, and there's been a lot of work done in these sorts of things. So I certainly encourage you to look a little bit more around the web or around other resources for these types of biases and effects. So let's talk about the endowment effect. So there's a group that did a lot of research on this. There's a field called experimental econ, and it evaluates a lot of things like the endowment effect. And the way it works is they bring people into a lab setting and they evaluate personal decisions. Sometimes it's done with students in classrooms. So there's a really famous experiment done related to a mug. So participants in the classroom were given a mug and then asked to trade the mug for pens. So the teacher, the facilitator, would have some pens, and they say, how many pens would I have to give you before you gave up this mug? Well, what they found is that individuals who had been given the mug, so when they handed the mug and said, how much would you be willing to accept to give up the mug, people that were given the mug valued it more than people who were simply asked to choose between the mug and pens. So rather than giving the mug, students might walk into the classroom and they see a mug and they see a pile of pens and they say, which one would you prefer? So if they hadn't already been given the mug, generally they're willing to pay, I suppose, or fewer pens than the mug. So actually holding something in your hand and giving to it imparts value. This has important implications for environmental policy. A lot of nature out there we already have. So if we're experiencing the forest outside of our town, that's something that we feel endowed to. We already have this value associated with it. It's different than just asking whether or not we'd be willing to pay for more open space or more parks. So the endowment effect is very real. The act of owning something really makes us value it more. We can talk also about something called loss aversion, and loss aversion is this attempt by economists or scientists, psychologists, to explain things like the endowment effect, or something called the sunk cost fallacy. Often is this idea that economists think that sunk costs should not be important, but in reality they are in very real world decisions, and status quo bias. And the idea is the way that you frame the question matters. And what the way the authors phrased it is that losses loom larger than gains. That the choice of losses in our minds is significant, and we behave. I guess we're more cautious, I guess, about losses than we often are about getting gains. So they asked a couple sets of questions. They asked people to choose between questions like A and B, and C and D. So two separate questions. And they asked people, would you prefer a certain win of $250 versus a 25% chance of winning $1,000 and a 75% chance of winning nothing? So the expected value of that option B is $250. So in expected value terms, they're the same. So they asked people, would you rather $250 for sure, or this 25% chance of winning $1,000. So they asked this question. And then they asked this the second set of questions, or the second question, and they said, would you prefer a certain loss of $750, so you know that you're going to lose $750, or a 75% chance of losing $1,000? Now again, in expected value terms, these are the same. So a 75% chance of losing $1,000 is, and that expected value is $750. So if you were completely sort of this ultra rational being, that C and D would be the same. Sort of, you would be indifferent between C and D. But what they found is people were not indifferent, actually. Choices that, or behaviors that were reflected in that first set of questions, this choice between A and B, were sometimes reversed in C and D, and that people that were otherwise sort of, looking at this equivalency in certain terms, it did not carry over to this idea of losses, that this chance of losing $1,000 loomed larger in our minds. So this idea that things that we lose, things that we give up, play a bigger role in our decision-making process. So once we're given a mug, if the choice is about giving it up, that choice is going to loom larger in our minds. So they use these measures of loss aversion to explain the endowment effect. So those are just a brief overview of non-market benefits and ways that we discuss them. We'll dig in a little bit deeper with some specific topics. As always, send me any questions. Thanks.